Just to review quickly, we started last week looking at the idea of character archetypes. And all this is the idea that there are certain kind of base core roles that you have to end up in stories a lot. And that are actually rooted, and this is important for our benefit, they're rooted in real life kind of situations about that you end up playing a certain role within a different context. It's not always the same. It's kind of the way in which you can be a son, a father, and a brother simultaneously, and it has to do with who you're working with at the time. You could also be a friend. I can be a teacher. And it depends on the context that determines what my role is. Well, when you have this character archetype, it's rooted in how all those interactions then affect the bigger picture of what's going on. Okay? So that's what we're kind of considering. So the first two that we've already looked at, first we looked at the lover, and I gave you the examples of Samson and David, particularly with Bathsheba in that situation. But that you tend to make decisions and do things from a heart, just how you feel about something and not really think it through, and that's what tends to get you in trouble. Now, there are good parts to this kind of character too that tend to be more compassionate and caring, but that oftentimes don't have the right limits to kind of rein that in and make that work well. And then we looked at the hero, who is your guy who knows how, it could be a woman as well, a heroine, who has some kind of challenge, often a kind of crisis of confidence, and we've thought about Gideon as someone who fell into that situation. Moses, in his early days, that his crisis was after he thought he could be a leader, but that didn't work his way, and when the Lord confronts him and calls him to leadership in Exodus 3 and 4, he doesn't want to go. He has to overcome that kind of crisis about himself, and you see him develop as a leader from that point forward. You saw Elijah in his low spot to have to overcome something. So that oftentimes has a hero quality to it. But now we want to talk about the wizard. Okay, sometimes this is called the magician. And we have to be very careful when we think about this, because I'm using literary terms. But in the Bible, actually, you run into this somewhat because of the miraculous. And when you have someone enter in that is in multiple cases, you see the whole storyline going on, that it is the miraculous that's in view, then typically this is the character type that you would identify. And it helps you because, for example, when in the New Testament, when you're going through and people are analyzing all the different parts of Jesus' life, they have a whole section dedicated solely to miracle stories. And it's because in those accounts, the role that Jesus has is specific to what he is doing outside the ordinary of what's possible in this world. So it's a magician or wizard role, and so that dominates the story, and that's the role he plays in that story. Now, a magician technically could be someone good or bad. Now, it would be some kind of false, right? You could have an idea of someone who's doing false miracles. Simon the sorcerer, it would fall into that kind of situation. You could have the idea, every once in a while it is alluded to, about those who would be portraying themselves as doing things that could still have this role. You even have specifically, for example, in Daniel chapter 2, all of the Persian magicians and wise men. Okay, now we don't often think about it, but the idea of a magician is coming from and related to the word magi, okay, which has the idea associated with wisdom. In Persia, here's your historical background now. Those men, they had all these tons of books written for any kind of kind of symbolism in dreams and that kind of thing. And that's what you see exposed in Daniel 2, when the king wants them to tell not just the interpretation, which they have their whole magician's book of interpreting dreams, okay? So, we have Freud, same thing. So you have that. They did that, but he said, no, you need to be able to tell me what the dream is first. Okay, that's when they said, oh, we can't do that. Why? Because all of a sudden they're up against the false nature of what they actually do. Well, it is then drawing attention to what is not possible. But this could be, it can also be portrayed sometimes as super knowledge, or if you want to get really subtle about it, political capital or wealth sometimes will operate the way. They can do anything because they can afford it, or they have that kind of power. They're being presented that way. But the typical way, the easy way to do this, I'm going to see if I can get everyone somewhere in this, okay, to show you how common this is. So I've got 3 names to throw at you so you understand, all right? And which name resonates with you may say something about how old you are. I'm just saying it's possible, okay? So let's see, Obi-Wan Kenobi, okay? Gandalf, Dumbledore. Okay, all 3, if you didn't have those, then we're going to have to go and say, take a course doing something else. I'm thinking about maybe we need to get like Mickey Mouse in the, but that would not go over well. But so that's what we're looking at, someone who can do these fantastic things and seems capable of anything. Okay, that's kind of the idea. Now, we mentioned Daniel. Actually, what you get to in the Old Testament as well is Elisha. You get some of this with Elijah, but the one in the Old Testament actually that does this so much, that kind of really dominates his character, is Elisha. We tend to think of miracles dominating Scripture, and they really don't. You really have a time of the miraculous at the time with Moses in saving Israel, bringing them out, and everything that went with his leadership to get them to the promised land. Now there was obviously some activity going on with inspiration for other books and for their fighting, okay, that was going on. But you have those miracles that are dedicated there. But really then, the next period where you have a lot is Elijah and Elisha. And you have certain kind of stretches of the passages for Elisha where that's all it is a whole series of miracle stories. And that is preparing us in a way, in a literary way, it's partially preparing us for what you get when you get to Jesus. That this is not unprecedented, it actually says something important. Okay? And that's the whole idea of what going from Moses to Elisha to Jesus in that arc through the Scripture is really important. It wasn't just an everything, do whatever you can do, fix every problem, wave your wand kind of situation. So that's kind of what we're talking about. So when you run into those situations, you think, okay, this is what the role is within this story, that it highlights the supernatural in a sense, okay? Then you have the rebel, okay? Now, you are going to see some rebels in Scripture, right? You will find some rebels. There's some people ought to automatically come up as being rebels. How about, I don't know, Absalom? Or let's go back earlier. What do we find? How about Korah's rebellion? You think maybe the leader of a rebellion might be a rebel? Okay. So you get those things going on. Those can be clear. There are some aspects early on of Jephthah. What he is doing is kind of counter to everybody else. That's the idea, somewhat of a rebel. And so you could have, my favorite description of this I found was what typically, if you have, let's say, you could have negative rebels, but you can also have positive rebels. Right? Star Wars, anyone? and that is the idea of chaotic good. Chaotic, I love that description. That is Han Solo, if you ever, right? It is chaotic good. Robin Hood. He was a rebellion against authority. That's the core aspect of the story. But it ended up with chaotic good, if you ever watched that. So you've got, usually with this, is you're looking for, or when you see that, is you've got someone who is a natural leader, who does have some courage in standing up to leadership, and even maybe when they shouldn't. It tends to be more, you'd think of charismatic and very resourceful. The problem can be what the goal is. That's where you see the difference. So all of these characters can occur, positive and negative, dependent upon character and goals. And that's how you kind of line everything up. The explorer is a little bit tricky. I find it to be a hard one. I don't think that it's there very much in Scripture. The idea of an explorer, though, is rooted in the concept of someone who would, say, go back to people who were exploring the world. So if you go back to the idea of somewhat Columbus, but Magellan, people, they were exploring for their own reasons, right? When you get into some of the ones who were coming over mainly looking for gold. But there were also those explorers, in some sense, you'd say the Pathfinders types. Okay? And for those not familiar, kind of a Daniel Boone, someone who is trailblazer. We'd think of a trailblazer. So that kind of explorer, Kit Carson was that for the further west a few years later. So that's kind of what you have going. This is the guy who's always pushing the limits, though. Okay? Doesn't accept the status quo, and so he's looking for adventure and new experiences all the time. Okay? I think that's hard to spot in Scripture. It's more nuanced when you find it there. I think in general, you may see that a little bit with Jacob. A touch. And then other than that, it's almost, you're looking at those who are trying to break up the status quo, such as maybe Haggai as a prophet, though I think that his prophet would be stronger. But if you're looking to understand it in popular kind of works, this is Indiana Jones. This is Captain Kirk. Okay. Star-Lord for those Marvel fans. Okay. Can always go in the next thing. And now I'm going to throw one out I found online. That's the only reason I found it. I want to emphasize that. But I needed to get this crowd involved. Ariel. Yeah, okay. So, courageous, independent, but nonconformists. Yes, David? Yeah, the give me this mountain speech would put him in an explorer category, and he had the background with the spies. So I like Caleb as an option there. Sure do. The problem can be never being satisfied. That's the bad side, right? The whole idea of always pushing forward, but then never being satisfied, and can be kind of aimless. So you're looking for where that line is all the time. Okay. All right. The sage. The sage. It's really hard to come up with pictures that don't have a copyright on them in some cases. This is typically your mentor, and you get a lot of these in Scripture. Okay, and that is this is the person who is very wise, who is going to mentor somebody through. It could be, for example, sometimes it was a priest, Jehoiada, right? Trying to be a mentor in some cases. You could have Moses was a sage figure specifically to how he talked with Joshua as a mentor. Eli in relationship to Samuel. That's a sage. So yes, this is Yoda as a clear sage in the Star Wars, and probably actually McGonagall would fall into this in the Harry Potter. She was the one that they went to for advice a lot of times, rather than Dumbledore, who was still more the wizard figure, which is interesting. The problem with, based upon those kind of characters, is you can sometimes be too passive. You want to have the wisdom do it all. And you really get this with Eli. It appears that Eli was a really good mentor for Samuel, including for things that he was unwilling to do himself, even though he tended to pass on some of his worst traits to Samuel too. He had blind spots, children. And Samuel had the same problem with his children. But very rational, this is your very intelligent, thoughtful person that can give really good advice, that everyone's always looking to for advice. And that's the mentor or the sage in these situations. And it can, sometimes, as I said, you can be more than one role depending upon what you're doing. Okay? The innocent. Now, this is really, can be very important. You see it a lot when I talked about the Bildungsroman theme of the idea of a coming of age. A lot of times this person starts as innocent, or not naive even. And because they've got to come in contact with the world, they haven't gotten there yet. But so it's someone who's naive, usually young, and then who must then have to deal with the real world to find out it's not all roses, and you find that out. And that you've kind of had a really good time and then you have to go off into the world. I think that the best example of this in Scripture is Joseph. Because here you have someone who talks about it and is rather innocent. It's dependent upon your take on him, but I think is rather innocent when you get in and you're introduced to him as being kind of the best brother of the group. And that's probably why Jacob treated him differently. As a child of his old age, Jacob had learned a lot, and he has a fondness for Joseph. He clearly has a higher character. And if you don't appreciate, this is again how literature works. Contrast, okay, Genesis 38 with Genesis 39. Now you're all sitting here thinking, I don't know what those say. That's okay, I'm going to tell you. In Genesis 37, we're introduced to Joseph. The next story is about Judah and Tamar, and how Judah marries son off, but that's a problem. He's not any good. Tamar, and he does all this other stuff, dies. Give him the next one, and he's not willing to be the father, according to the Levirate marriage law. And then he's got a younger one. He says, no, I'll give him to you. I'll give the younger one. Just wait a little while. And, kind of worried that she's just bad luck. But so that goes on, and she realizes that's not happening. So she dresses up as a prostitute. Now, y'all remembering this? Dresses up as a prostitute in order to get Judah, who's a widower. And so she just knows where Judah's going to be so that, now this is according to the Levirate marriage law. That's what she's based on then, because he's not given the one. That's what this is based on for her. Not for him. He doesn't know what's going on. And that moral situation for him and the way he behaved, which he recognized at the end somewhat, okay, that's also important part of Judah's growth arc, is based upon this. Okay, so he's going to get better, and that's why he ends up being acceptable to be the kingly line, his growth. It starts here. But in chapter 39, the very next chapter, this is where Joseph is sold into slavery and has to deal with Potiphar's wife and is willing to run and even ends up in prison because of his virtue. Okay? So you see how the way in which this is laid out, that you've got this big contrast in brothers of their character, highlighted particularly around their sexual morality. Okay? And that Joseph is being presented then as the one who is innocent and maintains his innocence even while and does not have trouble, and not that he didn't have to deal with things, we'll get to that in a moment, but he has to deal with that in this world, going to prison because of it, all these difficulties. How's he going to respond to that? And so when you get to the end of his story and he is dealing with the brothers, after the whole episode that's drawn out for what he did for them, but you remember at the very end, he's been rewarding them, brought them down, took care of them, did that. But when Jacob dies, the brothers are now thinking to themselves, uh-oh, now he's off the leash. He can do whatever he wants to us. And that they're entreating him, please be kind and all this. And Joseph's hurt by that. This, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Now, that's important as a story. Because what it shows is the one who is innocent in chapter 37, despite everything he's been through, and that is being rejected and sold by his brothers into slavery. Okay, that's the first thing. Then, after performing better than anybody else, being put into prison because of your virtue, life isn't fair. And then once you're in prison and God has provided you where you can interpret dreams, and then the guy that you interpret dreams and live, please remember me, doesn't, and you're left there until later, and now you come back, and finally you get an opportunity, and you come up, and you get everything's going well, and now you're having to confront these family members who were the cause of all of the heartache. How does he handle it in the end? He has perspective about it, and so you have an innocent coming of age without losing his character. As a matter of fact, he's grown from it. So you see these things. You see someone who is naive, a little too trusting, what you saw him with his brothers when he came to them, unskilled or powerless, right? He couldn't do anything to stop in this pit or what was happening, inexperienced and vulnerable. That's who he was. This was, go back a ways, in To Kill a Mockingbird, Scout is an innocent telling that story. Okay, that's very much a Scout. A Scout is really good for this. Okay. Now this one you'd think would be easy for us, right? Creator. But in a literary way, I'll just say, this is typically what you're going to see is it's going to be God, yes. But it can, in a literary fashion, so that it doesn't confuse you, should you ever see this, it can be an inventor, too. Just someone who seems to be capable of coming up with all kinds of things, so that when you get Frankenstein, right, is a very negative view of that, the mad scientist, that kind of thing. But in a positive way, how about this one? We'll see who we catch with this one. Caractacus Potts in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, who is this crazy inventor, right? Who turns this broken down car into something magical. That's the character. But in Scripture, you're coming into, and it's going to be God. Okay? Of the one who is in charge, who's responsible for what all this is. And therefore kind of sets the tone for everything. Of course, Genesis 1 and 2 is the most obvious. You also see it, though, probably all these passages, when there's some kind of confrontation of whether or not God has to come into, whether he's the greater God. What you get with Pharaoh in all those different plagues, all of them are addressing actually some different god of Egypt in different ways. You also see it say 1 Kings 18 with Elijah's confrontation on Mount Carmel. Okay, who's really God? That's who's really the creator. Who's in charge here? That kind of thing is partly what you have going on. So it's hard to kind of assign when you have God in the story. How do you put God as a character in the story? Because he's different. David? Oh, yeah. Captain Nemo, definitely. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Yes. Yes. And he wants control. It's one of those things where he wants control. I think Captain Nemo's a really good reference for this. Okay, now we get to the ruler. Okay, who do you think the ruler would be as you go through Scripture? What now? Okay, king, any kind of king. God could be. God could be the ruler of us, depending upon the story, right? He could be creator, but he could also be the ruler. Herod, Caesar, so specific kings in that situation. We're going to have a king in Esther, right? He's a major character in this. Pharaoh, right? Now, for Jesus in John 19, it's Pilate. Right? He's the ruler. He's a governor. He's not a king, but he's a ruler. He's by being a governor. In literature, depending upon what you kind of call this, King Arthur, and that kind of thing would be it. So you have both power. That can cover a lot of ground. What kind of power? Power tends to be very stable for what they're doing, at least as presented at the moment. High status. That's one of the things, is power with high status and therefore access to resources. That's typically who your ruler is. Now, on the negative side, when you have someone who's treated as a ruler, if he's a bad ruler, of course, we got a lot of those in Scripture, don't we? Someone who could be controlling, out of touch. Really pay attention when you get a ruler to how out of touch he might be with what's going on. A lot of enemies, and part of the motivation is fear of losing your position. That's one of the natural things about being in charge, is you're afraid of losing the position, right? It's kind of like everyone says, what's going on? It doesn't matter if you are in a democracy where you're worried about being voted out, or you are in a monarchy where you're afraid of being knifed out. It doesn't matter. That's a concern. So this is what you find with the ruler, okay? And so that's what we want to think about of who we're seeing here. Okay. You also, though, have the caregiver. And this is a role that appears in Scripture, but it's almost, I hate to say, sometimes I think we think of this as an afterthought, and yet in literature, it's never an afterthought. It's very intentional in literature, and I would suggest that we need to be paying attention to this role when we see it in Scripture for the significance it plays, all right? Because a caregiver is someone who is selfless, loyal, honorable, and a protector of some kinds, okay? I submit to you that Ruth is a caregiver. We think of that role, what's going through the book of Ruth, and yes, she is the one who lost a husband, but she's taking care of Naomi through the whole thing. And Naomi's bitterness being overcome is actually what is the MacGuffin through the story, okay? That's what's running through it. Jonathan. What kind of role does Jonathan serve in relationship to David? I mean, you say best friend, but that's caregiver status. He's done everything he can to protect David from his own father. A caregiver. Interestingly enough, I think that this is Uriah the Hittite. He is worried about everybody else. He is loyal to a fault when you go in and you look in 2 Samuel 12. Loyal to a fault. How about Barnabas? Barnabas was a caregiver in many ways. You see that from his introduction in Acts 4, where he's giving things out to help people in the church. He's wanting to protect and care for them in need. You see it for him bringing Saul of Tarsus into the church to be protected there and say, no, you need to accept him. And you see it actually somewhat within his role with Paul as they journey the first journey. I think he's a caregiver. Now, in literature, I mean, to me, this is the classic caregiver is Samwise Gamgee. Okay, That is, if you haven't read Lord of the Rings, that is a caregiver archetype just maxed out. Okay, and probably if a newer literature would probably be Hagrid, of the way in which his role was with the children. So you have someone who's compassionate, loving, caring, selfless, and a lot of times they're selfless to a fault. They end up getting hurt because they're more concerned about everyone else than they are themselves. That's your caregiver. All right. How about the everyman? This is an important role in literature, and it is more important than you will think in Scripture. Because the role of an everyman in a narrative is the one person that you need to be able to identify with. That's the whole thing, is someone that could be me. And therefore, you draw it into being part of the story of saying that. Whereas with some of the literature, it is, if you kind of feel like it's speaking directly to you, say in an epistle, even though it's not, it's written to somebody else, and you're reading their letter. But in a narrative, I get that guy. I get that situation. That would probably be me, You're looking for the person who is down to earth and relatable. Now, I think that there's probably not a better example of this in Scripture than Peter. Because Peter is the one who says what everyone else is thinking, right? He was voted by the other apostles person most likely to put his foot in his mouth. That's Peter, okay? He is who he is. He's comfortable with himself. This is who I am. Okay. Makes mistakes. Those are clear. He's an everyman. This is the role that Ron Weasley plays in Harry Potter. This is probably Bilbo Baggins from The Hobbit. Is like he's just going about his business and kind of being an everyman, and he's called on to have to join an adventure he's completely unprepared for. Right? He's an everyman. You're going on the adventure through him. Okay, that's an everyman type of character. It's not a large part of Scripture, but Timothy, I think, at least for preachers, Timothy is your everyman preacher. That is, he's willing to serve. He clearly can do good work, is highly respected by Paul, but yet still not so confident, willing to do what he can. That's an everyman kind of trait. Hardworking, empathetic, kind and virtuous, just grounded and relatable. That's what you kind of get here. Now we get to the jester. Now, you don't really want to be this person if you're in real life. You enjoy this person in the story. You enjoy the role of the jester in the story. You do not want to be this person in real life because the lessons are hard. Okay, because this is the person who fails to take things seriously enough or is in over his head and doesn't even appreciate that this is actually some kind of big stuff. Okay, and sometimes you can have the idea of the fool, which is kind of an offshoot of this. You see that idea in Scripture quite a bit, actually. But I'm just assuming that everyone after this long has seen some of this stuff, but when I think of the jester role in modern kind of stuff, is C-3PO in Star Wars is always concerned about all the wrong things. Always. It's always concerned about completely the wrong things. There can be a battle going on, and he's more worried about something else. Okay? That's kind of this role. Okay, now keep that in mind when I bring up a couple of names then. Esau. What was Esau's problem when we first really encounter him with selling his birthright, right, for pottage. Really? Because in that moment, you can't see beyond. You're going to act like you're dying because you're hungry? Didn't take it seriously enough. And that was a character trait. In a different way, I think this is Esau is a sad situation too, but Jonah is a jester in Jonah. He's playing a fool because he takes God seriously, but not his word, not what he's doing. And especially when you get to chapter 4, and he's just totally ridiculous about the plant. It's like he's refusing to learn the lesson. Okay? That's probably closer to a fool than a jester. So typically you see someone who is so fun-loving, so humorous, so likable, and that they can be smart and do all these things, but they tend to be impulsive and superficial. And that's what gets them. Okay? So when we go through, you're going to see, in literature, it's kind of, you need your comedy relief guys, right? And sometimes it's one of those things where I think about in college, you have some of the people who are the comedy relief guys in college. Anybody y'all experience this? They're the comedy relief guys, and that is to say no one you would ever want to work for or work for you. But aren't they fun guys in class? All right? So that's kind of what you end up with on this general arc. Now here's something we get and we need to understand in a scriptural kind of setting. That is the seducer. You are introduced to the idea of seduction in Genesis 3 with the serpent, correct? Okay? That is, it's the person who is introducing these ideas to try to pull people off sides. This is back to Joseph, what Potiphar's wife is in that story. There's an obvious seducer. Okay, how about Delilah for Samson? She's sitting there working him. That's an obvious seducer. When you look actually at Jezebel, particularly when you see what 1 Kings 20, with the Naboth's vineyard, she's the one that's trying to run things and pull Ahab up. Ahab's ultimately very sorry at the end. But he had a weak spot for how he thought. He tended to be one of these that was, again, probably a lover and thought he didn't think much about it. It was pulled away easily. Okay? So this is, to show you can have someone who, the difference is, this is actually Black Widow. Just use your powers for good. Okay, but that's Black Widow. How about the sirens in the Odyssey? Isn't that a classic example of the seducer? Okay. So what do you have? You tend to be, they're the ones that are manipulative, charismatic, but kind of like they're amoral in the sense is they're going to do whatever they need to do to get things done, right? Loki? Yeah, that's good. Is that throwing things out there, just trying to get you to bite all the time, right? Yeah, no, that's good. But they tend to be isolated, unfulfilled, standoffish, and selfish. And that just nailed him, didn't it? So that's a good one. But they're survivors and clever. So then he come in, and this may be even more Loki, is the trickster. And that's the person who makes a fool of people through deception and trickery. So I might lean toward Loki here. This is Jacob early on. He had a knack, because what was he named for? He was named as a supplanter, but he was a deceiver. He would play the games, right? For both in how he got the birthright and the blessing, he was tricking people. Okay? I'd say in a positive sense, that's what Jael did, right? So that y'all remember? Come on in, yeah, everything's fine, lay down, I'll take care of it. You wanted water, here's some milk. Everything will be okay, we'll watch over there. Sleep, tent peg, boom. Now there's a trickster. Everything about that was false about what was going on. All right, and now we get to the orphan. The idea of an orphan is not just that you don't know your parents or you lost your parents, but it often is a rise from obscurity. That is, for the point of view of the people in the story who are reading, it's coming from nowhere. Okay, you get a lot of this in Scripture. Daniel comes from nowhere, right? Who is that? Now, you get this in literature. You ought to realize how many times these people are orphans, right? You realize Harry Potter, orphan, right? Luke Skywalker, at least in Star Wars, orphan. Yeesh, okay. Simba. Well, now we get some more Disney in here. Orphan. Okay, and think about how many superheroes are orphans. I mean, it would be a lot easier to come up with a list of those that aren't. Right? Okay. What now? Every single character in a Dickens novel. That's right. Well, he came by that honestly, right? There's a good example, though, of the orphan story, because Charles Dickens, of course, his backstory was he had to go without and do a lot because his father didn't die but was in prison. And so he had to make it on his own. So he's kind of in that similar situation. So that would also work in literature. You often, though, when you have an orphan, that person will usually transition to a different character archetype by the time you're done. That's just, you can usually expect that. Okay, so they're usually, what they lack is opportunity, resources, and confidence. Okay, they're survivalists, have to be, and they're driven again because they have to be. All right. So the last thing, I've got like 1 minute. All this is, when I talk about the arc of the character or character arc, is taking all this information we went over about character specifically, highlighting what character archetype that person is in the individual smaller set stories, okay? Maybe that chapter, maybe even smaller section than a chapter, and then tracing the progress of the archetypes throughout their whole lifespan. And that's where you learn and to see character arc. And why does that matter? If the person essentially never changes, that's not your main character. It's because you're looking at the growth or the change that's happening. All right? And now we will get to Esther next week. Thank you for sticking with me in all this. I hope you're still learning it. We're going to be applying it as we go through.